The bitter wind sliced through Penelope Norwood's tattered dress like a knife as she stumbled forward, her bare feet numb beneath her, leaving crimson footprints in the pristine white snow. Each labored breath formed clouds that dissipated into the night air as she glanced over her shoulder, terror gripping her heart at the distant sound of shouts and barking dogs. Her stepfather wouldn't stop until he found her, until he made her pay for her defiance. It was January 1878, and the harsh winter had descended upon Snake River, Idaho, with unforgiving force. The small frontier town lay silent beneath a thick blanket of snow, most of its inhabitants tucked safely indoors against the howling blizzard. Penelope had been running for hours, the mountain pass proving more treacherous than she'd anticipated when she'd fled her stepfather's ranch earlier that evening. Her vision blurred as exhaustion overtook her, her legs finally giving way beneath her weight. As she collapsed into the snow, the cold embraced her like an old friend, promising the sweet relief of unconsciousness. Perhaps this was better, she thought hazily. Perhaps the cold would claim her before her stepfather could drag her back to that living hell. "Hey, miss. Good Lord, what are you doing out here?" The voice seemed to come from far away, carried on the wind like a dream. Penelope tried to lift her head but found she lacked the strength. Rough, warm hands suddenly turned her over, and she found herself staring up into the most startling blue eyes she'd ever seen, framed by a weather-beaten face beneath a wide-brimmed hat crusted with snow. "You're half frozen," the stranger murmured, concern etched into the lines of his face. Without hesitation, he shrugged off his heavy duster coat and wrapped it around her trembling body. "Don't you worry now, I've got you. He'll find me," Penelope whispered through chattering teeth, her fingers clutching weakly at the man's shirt. "Please don't let him find me." The cowboy's expression hardened as he gathered her into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. "Nobody's going to harm you, miss. Not while I'm around. I promise you that." As he carried her through the storm toward the faint glow of lantern light in the distance, Penelope allowed herself to slip into darkness, the stranger's promise of safety the last thing she heard before consciousness abandoned her. When Penelope next opened her eyes, the world was warm and bathed in soft firelight. She lay beneath several thick blankets on a narrow bed, the heavy coat that had been wrapped around her now hanging from a peg by the door of what appeared to be a small cabin. Pain radiated from her feet and hands as sensation returned to her frozen extremities, causing her to gasp. "You're awake." The deep voice came from across the room, where the cowboy sat at a rough-hewn table, a steaming cup between his hands. "That's good. Was starting to worry." He stood and approached the bed, and Penelope could now see him clearly for the first time. Tall and broad-shouldered, with sandy brown hair that curled slightly at the edges beneath his hat, which he'd removed upon entering the cabin. His face was handsome in a rugged way, with a strong jaw darkened by stubble and those striking blue eyes that had been her first memory. "Name's Riley Garrett," he said, pouring water from a pitcher into a cup. "I ranch about 5 miles west of here. This is my line cabin." Penelope struggled to sit up, wincing as pain shot through her limbs. "Penelope Norwood," she replied, accepting the water with shaking hands. "Thank you for saving me." "What were you doing out in that storm, Miss Norwood?" "Nearest homestead must be 10 miles from where I found you, and you weren't exactly dressed for the weather." The memory of her flight came rushing back, and Penelope's hand tightened around the cup. "I was running away," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "From my stepfather." Something flickered in Riley's eyes, recognition, perhaps, or understanding. Must be a mighty compelling reason to flee in the dead of winter without so much as a proper coat. Penelope looked down at her bandaged hands. "After my mother died last year, things changed. He changed. She swallowed hard. Last week he told me he'd arranged my marriage to a business associate of his, a man 30 years my senior who's already buried 2 wives. When I refused, Her voice broke. You don't need to explain further, Riley said quietly, his jaw tightening. How old are you, Miss Norwood? 20, Penelope replied. Old enough to know I'd rather die in the snow than be sold to a man who views me as nothing more than property. Riley nodded, his expression solemn. You're safe here for now. That storm's blown in something fierce. Nobody's going to be tracking anything until it passes, and that could be days. But after, the fear in her voice was unmistakable. We'll figure that out when we need to, Riley said firmly. For now, you need rest and food. You've got some nasty frostbite on your toes and fingers, but I think we caught it in time. Nothing seems blackened yet. Penelope stared at him, bewildered by this stranger's kindness. Why are you helping me? You don't even know me. Riley's mouth curved into a small smile, transforming his serious face. My pa raised me to never turn away someone in need. Besides, he added, returning to the stove where a pot simmered, no woman deserves to be traded like cattle, no matter what some men around these parts might think. As he spooned stew into a bowl, Penelope studied him. There was something about Riley Garrett that inspired trust, a quiet strength that didn't need to announce itself. For the first time since her mother's death, she felt a small flicker of hope. Your stepfather, Riley said, handing her the bowl, he have a name. Victor Holloway, she replied, the name tasting bitter on her tongue. He owns the Double H Ranch about 15 miles east of Snake River. He's influential in these parts. Riley's expression didn't change, but Penelope noticed how his shoulders tensed slightly. I know of him, was all he said. Eat your stew. You need your strength. As the howling wind battered the small cabin, Penelope ate slowly, savoring the simple but hearty meal. Her mind raced with uncertainty about what would happen when the storm cleared. But for this moment, wrapped in blankets in the warm cabin with Riley Garrett's steady presence nearby, she allowed herself to believe his promise of safety. The storm raged for 3 days, confining them to the small cabin. Riley proved to be a considerate companion, giving Penelope the bed while he slept in a chair by the fire. He was quiet by nature, but not unfriendly, answering her questions about his ranch and life in Snake River with patient thoroughness. Been on my own since I was 17, he told her as they sat by the fire on the second evening, snow still whipping against the windows. Pa died of consumption, left me the land and not much else. Built it up, though, bit by bit. All by yourself? Penelope asked, impressed. Riley nodded. Got about 50 head of cattle now, nothing compared to some spreads, but it's mine. Hire a couple hands during busy seasons. He poked at the fire. What about you? Before your ma passed, Penelope's fingers traced the pattern on the quilt draped across her lap. We lived in Boston. My father was a professor literature. He died when I was 12. Mother remarried 3 years later, and Victor convinced her to move west for opportunities, as he called them. Her mouth twisted bitterly. I think he just wanted her inheritance and to get her away from anyone who knew her. And your mother didn't see through him. Love can blind us to many things, Penelope said softly. By the time she realized who she'd really married, it was too late. She wasn't strong like she used to be. Something inside her just gave up. Riley's eyes were sympathetic. I'm sorry. After she died, Victor made it clear I was a burden he'd only tolerated for my mother's sake. The only value I had was what he could get for marrying me off. Riley's hand clenched into a fist where it rested on his knee. No man has the right to sell another human being. Not ever. On the morning of the 4th day, the storm finally broke, revealing a world transformed into a glistening white expanse. The sun shone brilliantly off the snow, almost painfully bright after days of gray skies. Penelope stood at the window, her bandaged feet now able to bear her weight, though still tender. "Storm's past," Riley observed, coming to stand beside her. "I need to check on my stock, make sure they weathered it all right." Fear clutched at Penelope's heart. "Will you? Will I?" She couldn't finish the question. Riley turned to her, his expression earnest. "I meant what I said when I found you. I won't let anyone harm you, Miss Norwood." "Penelope," she corrected softly. "Please call me Penelope." "Penelope," he repeated, and something in the way her name sounded in his deep voice made her breath catch. "I don't aim to deliver you back to a man who'd treat you so poorly, but we need to think this through careful like. Your stepfather's not a man to cross lightly from what I've heard." "No, he isn't," she agreed, dread pooling in her stomach. "He has the sheriff in his pocket and half the county council indebted to him if I'm found here." "Then we won't let you be found," Riley said simply, reaching for his coat. "You stay put. Cabin's well stocked. Keep the door barred while I'm gone. I'll be back before sunset." Penelope watched from the window as he saddled his horse and rode off, the animal pushing through snow that reached its chest in places. When he disappeared from view, she felt suddenly very alone and vulnerable. Despite the solid walls of the cabin surrounding her, true to his word, Riley returned as the sun was beginning its descent, his cheeks ruddy from the cold but his expression satisfied. "Stock's fine. Lost a yearling calf, but the rest made it through." As he hung up his coat, he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small bundle. "Brought you something." Curious, Penelope unwrapped the bundle to find a pair of women's boots, well worn but sturdy, and a folded dress of simple brown wool. "Where did you get these?" "My nearest neighbor's wife, Widow Jenkins. Sweet woman, lost her husband last spring. She was happy to help when I said I had a visitor caught in the storm who'd lost her things." "You told her about me." Penelope couldn't keep the alarm from her voice. Riley shook his head. "Just said you were passing through to visit family when the storm hit. Martha Jenkins isn't one for gossip, and she lives even more remote than I do. No one will hear about you from her." Penelope held the dress against herself, overwhelmed by his thoughtfulness. "Thank you. They might be a bit big. Martha's a stout woman, but it's better than what you arrived in." Her tattered dress had been beyond salvation, torn and bloodied from her desperate flight through the forest. For the past days, she'd been wearing one of Riley's shirts, which hung to her knees, and a pair of his wool trousers rolled up multiple times at the ankles. "I also brought news," Riley said, his tone growing serious as he stoked the fire. "Holloway's men were in town yesterday, asking questions. Seems they tracked you as far as the creek crossing before the storm wiped out any trail." Penelope sank onto the edge of the bed, her hands clutching the dress. "They'll keep looking." "Undoubtedly," Riley agreed, "but they're looking for a woman on foot. Not a ranch hand riding alongside his boss." His eyes met hers, gauging her reaction. "I've been thinking. My main house is more defensible than this cabin, and I need to get back there sooner rather than later. If you cut your hair and wear some of my old clothes, we might just get you there without anyone being the wiser." "You'd risk that?" "For me?" Penelope asked, stunned by the suggestion. Riley crouched before her, his gaze steady. "Penelope, I made you a promise in that snowstorm, and I aim to keep it. Now, I won't pretend it'll be easy. We'll need to be careful, real careful, but I believe we can outwit Holloway." Looking into his determined face, Penelope felt something shift inside her. This man, this stranger who owed her nothing, was willing to risk everything to help her. It defied everything her recent experiences had taught her about the nature of men. "Why?" she whispered, needing to understand. Riley was silent for a long moment. "When I was a boy," he finally said, I watched my mother endure years of my father's drunken rages. He wasn't always that way. Grief and whiskey changed him after my baby sister died. But watching someone you love suffer and being powerless to stop it." He shook his head. "I swore I'd never stand by if I could help someone else. Never." Impulsively, Penelope reached out and touched his cheek, a gesture of compassion that surprised them both. Riley's eyes widened slightly, and for a breath, they simply looked at each other, something unspoken passing between them. Then Riley cleared his throat and stood. "We'll leave at first light tomorrow. Best get some rest." That night, as Penelope lay in the narrow bed listening to Riley's steady breathing from his place by the fire, she made a decision. She would trust this man not because she had no choice, but because something in her heart told her he was worthy of that trust. Dawn broke clear and cold, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. Penelope sat on a stool as Riley stood behind her, scissors in hand. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his fingers gently lifting a strand of her long auburn hair. Penelope nodded resolutely. "It's just hair. It will grow back." In truth, her heart ached a little at the thought of losing her hair, which had been her mother's pride. But survival mattered more than sentiment. Riley worked with surprising dexterity, cutting her hair short like a young man's, leaving it just long enough to tuck behind her ears. When he was finished, he swept up the shorn locks and tossed them into the fire, where they sizzled and curled into ash. "No evidence," he explained at her questioning look. "Now let's get you dressed." The transformation was remarkable. With her hair cut short, wearing Riley's old clothes, a flannel shirt, woolen vest, trousers, and the boots from Martha Jenkins, stuffed with rags to fit her smaller feet, Penelope hardly recognized herself in the small mirror Riley produced. "Pull the hat low," Riley instructed, settling a battered slouch hat on her head. "Keep your head down if we encounter anyone. From a distance, you'll pass for a young ranch hand." They set out just as the sun cleared the mountains, Riley on his sturdy bay gelding and Penelope on a placid mare he kept as a pack horse. The snow made travel slow, but Riley seemed to know every fold of the land, guiding them along routes that kept them mostly hidden from any distant observers. "My ranch is nestled in a small valley," Riley explained as they rode. "Not grand, but the location's good, sheltered from the worst weather, with a creek that never fully freezes. It's why I was able to build a life there when others couldn't make a go of it." The pride in his voice was evident, and Penelope found herself eager to see this place that meant so much to him. "How far are we from Snake River?" she asked. "About 8 miles as the crow flies," Riley replied. "But we're taking a roundabout way, so it'll be closer to 12. They rode in companionable silence for a time, the only sounds the creak of leather and the soft thud of hooves in snow. Penelope had ridden since childhood, one of the few activities Victor hadn't forbidden, but never through such spectacular country. Despite her fears, she found herself admiring the pristine landscape, the way the sunlight caught in ice crystals hanging from pine boughs. As they crested a small rise, Riley suddenly raised his hand, signaling her to stop. His posture had gone rigid, alert. "Riders," he murmured, pointing to a distant spot where the forest met a clearing. Penelope's heart hammered as she made out 3 men on horseback, still far away but moving in a pattern that suggested they were searching for something or someone. "Holloway's men," she whispered, unconsciously edging her horse closer to Riley's. He nodded grimly. "Likely. They're thorough, I'll give them that." He surveyed their surroundings with calculating eyes. "We need cover. Follow me and stay close." He led them down the back side of the ridge, into a thicket of pine trees, so dense their branches interlaced overhead. creating a natural ceiling that had prevented much of the snow from reaching the ground. They dismounted, and Riley guided the horses deeper into the shelter, where he tied them securely. "We'll wait them out," he said quietly. "With luck, they'll pass by without ever knowing we were here." They settled against the trunk of a massive pine, its lowest branches creating a protective canopy around them. Riley's body was warm beside hers, his shoulder pressed against hers as they huddled together for warmth and concealment. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as they sat in tense silence. Penelope could hear the distant sounds of the riders calling to each other, their voices carried on the crisp air. At one point, the sounds grew closer, and Riley's hand found hers, squeezing gently in reassurance. When hoofbeats finally faded into the distance, Riley released a long breath. "They've moved on," he said, but made no move to rise. "We'll give it a bit longer to be safe." Penelope nodded, suddenly very aware of his hand still covering hers, warm and calloused. "Thank you," she said softly. Riley looked at her, something unreadable in his expression. "For what?" "For everything. For saving me that night. For not asking questions when you should have. For risking yourself now." She met his gaze directly. "Most men wouldn't do what you're doing." "I'm not most men," Riley replied simply. "No," Penelope agreed, a small smile touching her lips. "You certainly aren't." Something shifted in Riley's eyes, a warmth kindling there that had nothing to do with the cold they were sheltering from. For a moment, Penelope thought he might say something more, but instead he released her hand and rose to his feet. "We should keep moving while we have daylight," he said, his voice slightly rougher than before. "Still a ways to go." They continued their journey with heightened caution, Riley leading them through terrain that seemed designed to conceal their passing gullies, wooded draws, and rocky outcroppings that would leave minimal tracks. By mid-afternoon, Penelope could tell they were descending into a valley, the land sloping gently downward. "There it is," Riley said at last, pulling his horse to a halt at the edge of a stand of trees. Below them lay a small valley, cupped by gentle hills. A creek wound through it like a silver ribbon, and nestled beside it stood a sturdy log cabin, larger than the line cabin they'd left that morning, with a barn and several corrals nearby. Smoke rose from the chimney, curling lazily into the blue sky. "Someone's there," Penelope said, alarm sharpening her voice. Riley nodded but didn't seem concerned. "That'll be Caleb, my hired hand. Good man, been with me 3 years now, we can trust him." "You're sure?" Penelope couldn't help but ask. Riley's eyes were steady on hers. "With my life." "And with yours." The sincerity in his voice quieted her fears, and she nodded. "Lead on, then." They approached the ranch openly, no longer attempting to hide their tracks. As they neared, a tall, lean man emerged from the barn, shading his eyes against the sun. When he recognized Riley, he raised a hand in greeting. "'Bout time you showed up," he called. "Was starting to think you'd decided to winter in that line cabin." "Takes more than a blizzard to keep me away," Riley replied easily, dismounting as they reached the yard. "Everything all right here?" "Right as rain," Caleb replied. Then his gaze shifted curiously to Penelope, still mounted on her horse. "Who's your friend?" Riley glanced up at Penelope, then back to Caleb. "Let's get inside," he said, his tone making it clear this wasn't a conversation for the open air. Inside the cabin, which was warm and surprisingly comfortable with its sturdy furniture and colorful woven rugs, Riley explained the situation to Caleb while Penelope stood nervously by the fire, still in her disguise. Caleb whistled low when Riley finished. "Holloway, huh? Man's got a reputation meaner than a rabid wolf." His eyes, kind beneath bushy eyebrows, settled on Penelope. "No offense, miss, but you've stirred up one hell of a hornet's nest." "I'm aware," Penelope said quietly, I wouldn't blame either of you for sending me on my way. Caleb snorted. That ain't how we do things here, is it, Riley? No, Riley agreed firmly. It isn't. He turned to Penelope. You'll stay here as long as you need to. We'll figure out a more permanent solution when things calm down. Relief washed over Penelope, followed quickly by a renewed sense of guilt. I've already caused you so much trouble. Trouble finds folks whether they're looking for it or not, Caleb said philosophically. At least this kind's worth the having. He looked between Penelope and Riley, a knowing glint in his eye that made Penelope wonder if he saw something she didn't. Well, I best get back to the evening chores. You two get settled. After Caleb left, Riley showed Penelope to a small bedroom off the main living area. It's not much, he said, almost apologetically, but it's private. The room was simple but clean, with a narrow bed, a small chest of drawers, and a window that looked out toward the hills. It's perfect, Penelope assured him. There's a trunk in the corner with some of my mother's things, Riley said, a hint of awkwardness in his voice. Might be some clothes that would fit you better than mine. She was a small woman, not unlike yourself. Touched by this offer, Penelope nodded. Thank you. That evening, the three of them sat around Riley's table, sharing a hearty stew that Caleb had prepared. Dressed now in a simple blouse and skirt that had belonged to Riley's mother, Penelope felt almost like herself again, despite her shorn hair. Holloway's men came through 2 days ago, Caleb informed them as they ate. Asked if we'd seen a young woman, red hair, traveling alone. Said she was Holloway's daughter, run off in a fit of madness after her mother's death. Penelope's spoon clattered against her bowl. That's a lie. My mother has been dead for nearly a year, and I am most certainly not mad. We know, Riley said soothingly, shooting Caleb a warning look. It's just his way of ensuring folks would turn you in without asking questions. Did they say if they'd be back? Penelope asked Caleb. The older man nodded grimly. Said they'd check every homestead and ranch within 50 miles, offering $100 to anyone with information. $100, Penelope repeated hollowly. That's enough to tempt almost anyone in these parts. Anyone without principles, Riley corrected. But you're right, we need to be careful. For now, you'll have to stay out of sight if anyone comes calling. And we'll stick with the story that you're my cousin. Come to help after falling on hard times, if we're forced to explain your presence. That night, alone in the small bedroom, Penelope lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch, the distant lowing of cattle, the soft hooting of an owl, the creak of the cabin as it settled. So much had changed in such a short time. A week ago, she had been a prisoner in her stepfather's house. Now she was a fugitive, dependent on the kindness of a man she barely knew, and yet she didn't feel afraid. There was something about Riley Garrett that inspired confidence, a steadiness to him that made her believe his promises of protection. It was more than his physical strength or his evident capability. It was a fundamental decency that shone through his every action. Penelope turned onto her side, pulling the quilt more snugly around her shoulders. She wondered what her mother would think of her situation now. Margaret Norwood had been a gentle woman, but with an unexpected streak of steel when it came to matters of principle. She would have understood Penelope's refusal to be sold into marriage. She might even have approved of Riley's gallantry. With that comforting thought, Penelope finally drifted into sleep, more peaceful than any she had known in months. The next week passed in a rhythm that quickly became familiar. Penelope, determined not to be merely a burden, insisted on helping with household tasks. She proved to be a capable cook, much to the delight of both men, and tackled the mending that had accumulated in the bachelor household with cheerful efficiency. Riley spent his days tending to ranch work alongside Caleb, checking on cattle, repairing fences damaged in the storm, and ensuring their supplies would last through the remaining winter months. Each evening, he returned to the cabin with ruddy cheeks and tired eyes, but he always found time to sit with Penelope after supper, sometimes talking, sometimes simply enjoying comfortable silence as he whittled or she sewed. It was during these quiet evenings that Penelope began to truly know Riley Garrett. She learned that, beneath his reserved exterior, lay a thoughtful mind and a dry wit that occasionally surfaced in unexpected moments. He spoke of books he'd read, surprising her with his knowledge of literature, a passion he attributed to a schoolteacher who had taken an interest in him as a boy. In turn, Penelope shared stories of her life before Victor Holloway, of growing up in Boston with parents who had valued education and kindness above all else. She described the shock of transplantation to the frontier, the struggle to adapt to a place so different from the city she had known. "Do you miss it?" Riley asked one evening as they sat before the fire, Caleb having retired early with complaints of an aching back. "Boston, I mean." Penelope considered the question seriously. "I miss what it represented, a life where I knew what to expect, where there were rules that everyone followed." She smiled wryly. "Or at least pretended to follow. But I don't think I could go back now, even if it were possible. I've seen too much, changed too much." "The West changes people," Riley agreed. "Brings out who they truly are, for better or worse." "And what did it bring out in you?" Penelope asked, curious. Riley stared into the fire, the flames reflecting in his blue eyes. "Determination, I suppose. Out here, you either fight for what's yours or you lose it. There's no in-between." He glanced at her. "But it also taught me the value of neighbors, of community. Out here, refusing to help someone in need isn't just unkind, it can be a death sentence." "Is that why you helped me?" "Because it's the way of the West." "No," Riley said softly. "I helped you because it was the right thing to do. Because when I saw you lying there in the snow, something inside me couldn't bear the thought of riding away." Their eyes met, and Penelope felt a warmth bloom in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire before them. In that moment, she realized with startling clarity that her feelings for Riley Garrett had grown beyond gratitude into something deeper, more complex. Before either could speak again, a sound from outside broke the moment, the distant but unmistakable approach of horses. Riley was on his feet in an instant, moving to the window. "Riders," he said tersely. "3, maybe 4. He reached for his rifle, which always stood ready by the door. "Get to your room. Stay quiet." Heart pounding, Penelope hurried to the small bedroom, closing the door softly behind her. Through the thin walls, she could hear the muffled sounds of Riley waking Caleb, their hushed voices urgent. Then the front door opened and she heard Riley's voice, deliberately casual, calling out a greeting to the late-night visitors. Pressing her ear to the door, Penelope strained to hear what was happening. The newcomers' voices were unfamiliar, but their tone was not friendly. "Heard you might be harboring a fugitive, Garrett," one voice said, the words carrying clearly in the night air. "That's so." Riley's voice was calm, unperturbed. "And who might that be?" "Holloway's daughter. Red-haired girl, pretty thing, ran off about 2 weeks back." "Haven't seen any red-haired girls around here," Riley replied evenly. "Just me and my hired hand, same as always." There was a pause then. "Mind if we take a look around? Holloway's offering a handsome reward." "As a matter of fact, I do mind." Riley's voice had hardened. "It's late, and I don't know you boys. My land, my rules. You want to search someone's property, get the sheriff." A different voice now, sharper with threat. "Holloway won't take kindly to folks who don't cooperate." "That's between me and Holloway," Riley replied. "Now, I think it's time you gentlemen moved along." The tension in the air was palpable even through the closed door. Penelope held her breath, terrified that at any moment violence would erupt. Then, to her immense relief, she heard the sounds of horses moving away, accompanied by muttered curses. When Riley opened her door a few minutes later, his face was grim. "They're gone for now," he said, "but they'll be back, likely with reinforcements." Penelope's hands trembled as she clasped them together. "I should leave. I'm putting you in danger." "No," Riley said firmly. "That's exactly what they want to flush you out, get you running scared and alone." He crouched before her where she sat on the edge of the bed, taking her cold hands in his warm ones. "We knew this might happen. I'm prepared for it." "What will we do?" she whispered. "We'll stay alert for one thing," Riley said. "Caleb and I will take turns keeping watch, and tomorrow we'll make some preparations just in case." His thumbs rubbed gentle circles on the backs of her hands. "Don't lose heart now, Penelope. We'll get through this." Looking into his steadfast eyes, Penelope found herself believing him, despite the fear that still coursed through her veins. "Promise me you won't do anything foolish," she said impulsively. "I couldn't bear it if you were hurt because of me." Something softened in Riley's expression. "I promise to be careful," he said. "But I won't promise not to protect you. That's not a promise I could keep." Before she could respond, he stood, releasing her hands. "Try to get some rest. Dawn will be here before we know it." As he predicted, the next day brought renewed activity. Riley and Caleb spent the morning reinforcing the cabin's defenses, checking the shutters, ensuring all weapons were cleaned and loaded, moving supplies to ensure they could withstand a potential siege. Penelope helped where she could, preparing food that could be easily stored and consumed if necessary, filling every available container with fresh water. By mid-afternoon, they had done all they could reasonably do to prepare. The atmosphere in the cabin was tense but determined as they sat down to an early supper. "I've been thinking," Caleb said as they ate. "Might be smart for me to ride into town tomorrow, see what folks are saying. Gauge how serious this search really is." Riley nodded thoughtfully. "Could be useful to have ears on the ground, but be careful don't draw attention." "I was born careful," Caleb replied with a wry smile, "unlike some I could mention." He shot a meaningful look at Riley, who ignored it. After they had finished eating, Caleb excused himself to take the first watch outside, leaving Riley and Penelope alone in the cabin. "You should get some rest," Penelope told Riley, noting the tired lines around his eyes. "You've barely slept since those men came last night." "I'm fine," Riley insisted. Though he couldn't quite suppress a yawn, Penelope smiled fondly. "Clearly. At least sit down before you fall down." Riley acquiesced, lowering himself into the chair beside the fire. Penelope took the seat opposite him, picking up the mending she had set aside earlier. They sat in companionable silence for a time, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the soft whisper of Penelope's needle through fabric. "Can I ask you something?" Penelope said eventually, not looking up from her work. "Of course." "What will happen when this is over, if we manage to resolve this situation with my stepfather?" Riley was quiet for so long that Penelope finally raised her eyes to find him watching her, his expression thoughtful. "That depends," he said slowly. "On what? On what you want to happen." He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. "What do you want, Penelope?" The directness of the question caught her off guard. What did she want? Freedom from fear, certainly. A chance to build a life on her own terms. But as she looked at Riley, his face open and earnest in the firelight, she realized her desires had grown more specific in the short time she had known him. "I want to stay," she said simply, her heart racing at her own boldness. "Here, if that's possible." Something kindled in Riley's eyes, hope, perhaps, or happiness. "It's more than possible," he said softly. "It's what I've been hoping you'd say." He reached across the space between them, taking her hand in his. Penelope, I know we've not known each other long, but these past days, they've meant something to me. You mean something to me. Penelope's breath caught in her throat. Riley, before she could say more, the door burst open and Caleb rushed in, his expression urgent. Riders coming, he said tersely. At least 8 of them, and they're moving with purpose. Riley was on his feet instantly, his hand falling away from Penelope's. Holloway's men, Caleb nodded grimly. Looks that way, and they're armed for trouble. Riley turned to Penelope, his expression grave. Get your coat. We need to move quickly. What? Where are we going? Penelope asked. Even as she reached for the coat Riley had given her one of his mother's, fitted to her by Penelope's own hand. There's a cave in the hills behind the house, Riley explained rapidly, gathering supplies into a sack. It's well hidden, hard to find if you don't know it's there. You and Caleb will go there while I deal with our visitors. Alarm shot through Penelope. No, I won't leave you to face them alone. This isn't up for debate, Riley said firmly. Caleb will keep you safe. I'll join you when I can. And if you can't? Penelope demanded, fear making her voice sharp. Riley paused in his preparations, his eyes meeting hers. I will, he said with quiet confidence. I promise. Before she could argue further, Caleb intervened. He's right, Miss Penelope, this is the best way. Riley can handle himself, and he'll be able to do that better knowing you're safe. Torn between fear for Riley and the logic of their plan, Penelope finally nodded. Be careful, she said to Riley, her voice tight with emotion. Please. In response, Riley did something unexpected. He crossed to her in 2 quick strides, cupped her face in his hands and kissed her briefly but with unmistakable feeling. For luck, he murmured as he pulled away, a small smile touching his lips despite the gravity of the situation. Stunned by the kiss and what it implied, Penelope could only nod wordlessly as Caleb took her arm and guided her toward the back door. As they slipped out into the gathering dusk, she cast one last glance over her shoulder, catching a glimpse of Riley standing tall and resolute in the doorway of his home, ready to defend what was his. The journey to the cave was difficult in the fading light, their path taking them up a steep, wooded hillside behind the ranch. Caleb led the way confidently, one hand on his rifle, the other occasionally reaching back to steady Penelope when the terrain grew particularly treacherous. How much further? Penelope asked, her breath coming in puffs of white in the cold air. Not far, Caleb assured her. Just beyond that ridge. As they crested the ridge, Penelope heard the distant sound of voices from the direction of the ranch, followed by what might have been a shout. She froze, turning back instinctively. Keep moving, Caleb urged, his voice gentle but firm. Riley knows what he's doing. But what if they hurt him? Penelope couldn't keep the fear from her voice. Riley Garrett's the most capable man I know, Caleb said with quiet confidence. He's also too smart to take unnecessary risks. Now come on, we need to get you hidden. Reluctantly, Penelope allowed Caleb to lead her onward. The cave, when they reached it, was little more than a narrow crevice in the rocky hillside, almost invisible until they were right upon it. Inside, however, it widened into a space large enough for several people to sit comfortably. Caleb struck a match and lit a small lantern he had brought, revealing a space that showed signs of occasional use, a stack of firewood against one wall, a few battered cooking implements, even a folded blanket. Riley uses this place sometimes when he's hunting, Caleb explained, seeing her surprised expression. Or when he just needs to think. Man likes his solitude now and then. Penelope nodded, settling onto a flat rock as Caleb built a small, nearly smokeless fire. The cave was cold but protected from the wind, and the small fire soon brought a measure of warmth to their shelter. What do we do now? Penelope asked, huddling close to the flames. We wait, Caleb said simply. And we trust Riley. The hours passed with excruciating slowness. Caleb periodically ventured to the mouth of the cave to listen for any sounds of approach, but each time he returned with no news. Midnight came and went, and still Riley did not appear. Something's wrong, Penelope said at last, unable to contain her worry any longer. He should have come by now. Caleb's weathered face was grim in the firelight. You might be right, he admitted, but our instructions were clear: stay here until he comes. And if he can't come, Penelope demanded, if he's hurt or captured or, she couldn't bring herself to voice the worst possibility. Then we stick to the contingency plan, Caleb said firmly. At first light I take you to Widow Jenkins' place. She'll hide you while I find out what's happened. Penelope shook her head decisively. No, if Riley's in trouble, it's because of me. I won't run and hide while he suffers for my sake. Miss Penelope, I'm going back, she said, rising to her feet. With or without you, Caleb. The old cowboy stared at her for a long moment, then sighed heavily. Riley was right about you, he said with reluctant admiration. Stubborn as they come. He stood, checking his rifle. If we're doing this, we do it my way. Stay behind me, do exactly as I say, and if I tell you to run, you run. No arguments, Penelope nodded, relief flooding through her. Thank you, Caleb. They made their way back down the hillside with caution, guided by moonlight and Caleb's intimate knowledge of the terrain. As they neared the ranch, Caleb signaled for absolute silence, leading them through a stand of trees that afforded a clear view of the cabin and yard. The scene before them was one of eerie stillness. Several horses were tethered near the barn, but there was no sign of their riders. Light spilled from the cabin windows, casting yellow rectangles onto the snow. Something's not right, Caleb whispered. Too quiet. They crept closer, keeping to the shadows. When they reached the edge of the clearing, Caleb motioned for Penelope to stay put while he moved forward to investigate. She watched, heart in her throat, as he silently approached the cabin, peering cautiously through a window before making his way to the back door. A moment later, he reappeared, beckoning urgently to her. Penelope hurried forward, questions tumbling from her lips as soon as she was close enough to whisper. What is it? Where's Riley? He's inside, Caleb interrupted, his expression grim, and he's hurt. Penelope pushed past him into the cabin, her eyes immediately finding Riley slumped in a chair by the fire, his shirt darkened with blood on one side. Riley, she gasped, rushing to his side. His eyes opened at her voice, clouded with pain but alert. Penelope, what are you doing here? You should be, never mind that, she interrupted, already examining his wound with gentle fingers. What happened? Holloway's men, Riley said through gritted teeth. They weren't interested in talking, started shooting almost as soon as they arrived. How bad is it? Caleb asked from the doorway where he stood keeping watch. Riley grimaced. Bullet grazed my ribs, painful but not serious. I managed to drive them off, but they'll be back. They know you're here now, Penelope. One of them recognized your coat hanging by the door. Fear clutched at Penelope's heart, but she pushed it aside, focusing on the immediate need. We need to clean and bind this wound, she said decisively. Caleb, can you fetch me hot water and bandages? As she tended to Riley's injury, washing away blood and applying a salve of herbs from his mother's carefully preserved medical supplies, Penelope asked the question that had been burning in her mind. Why didn't you come to the cave? Why stay here, knowing they might return? Riley winced as she wrapped a bandage around his torso. Couldn't risk leading them to you, he said simply. And I needed to buy time. Time for what? Penelope asked, securing the bandage with practiced hands. Riley exchanged a glance with Caleb. Time for the telegram I sent yesterday to reach its destination. Time for help to arrive. Telegram. What telegram? To whom? Riley's mouth curved in a small, pained smile. To the federal marshal in Boise, an old friend of my father's. I told him about Holloway, about his threats and illegal activities, about you. Penelope sat back on her heels, stunned. You've been planning this all along. Since the night those men first came, Riley confirmed. I knew then that we couldn't handle this alone, not indefinitely. Holloway has too much influence locally. We needed outside authority. And you think this marshal will help? Penelope couldn't keep the skepticism from her voice. She had learned the hard way that men in positions of power rarely sided against those like her stepfather. Marshal Davis is a good man, Riley said firmly. And he's been looking for an excuse to investigate Holloway for years. Your situation might be just what he needs. Hope, fragile but persistent, bloomed in Penelope's chest. How long until he comes? Soon, Riley said. But we need to be ready for Holloway's men to return before then. They won't have given up. As if summoned by his words, Caleb, who had moved to the window, suddenly stiffened. Riders coming, he said tersely. At least a dozen this time. Riley struggled to his feet, grimacing with pain. They're not wasting any time, he muttered, reaching for his rifle. You can't fight, Penelope protested. You're injured. I can shoot, Riley countered grimly. Caleb, take Penelope out the back. Head for the Jenkins place, it's her best chance now. No, Penelope said firmly, planting herself before him. I'm not leaving you, not again. Riley's expression softened, his free hand coming up to touch her cheek. Penelope, please, I can't protect you and fight them at the same time. Not like this. Then we face them together, she insisted. All of us. The sound of approaching horses grew louder and Caleb moved to the other window, rifle ready. Whatever we're doing, we need to decide now, he said urgently. Riley looked from Penelope to Caleb, then nodded slowly. Together, then. But at the first sign that things are going badly, you two slip out the back. Promise me. Before either could respond, a voice called from outside, amplified by the still night air. Riley Garrett, this is Victor Holloway. Send out my stepdaughter and we'll leave you in peace. Refuse, and you'll regret it. Penelope's blood ran cold at the sound of her stepfather's voice. She hadn't expected him to come personally. He usually sent others to do his dirty work. His presence meant he was desperate, which made him more dangerous than ever. Riley moved to the window, staying carefully to one side. She's not your property, Holloway, he called back. She's a free woman making her own choices. She's a foolish girl who doesn't know what's good for her, Holloway retorted. And you're a dead man if you don't hand her over in the next minute. Riley turned to Penelope, his eyes questioning. She shook her head firmly. No surrender. I think we've talked enough, Riley shouted to Holloway. You want her, you'll have to come through me. The response was immediate, a volley of gunfire that shattered windows and splintered wood as bullets tore through the cabin walls. Caleb and Riley returned fire, carefully aimed shots that, judging by the cries outside, found their marks. Penelope crouched behind an overturned table, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. The cacophony of gunfire was deafening, the air filling with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Through it all, she watched Riley, who fought with grim determination despite his injury. Each time he fired, his face tightened with pain, but he never faltered, never retreated. The exchange continued for what seemed like hours but was probably only minutes. Then, suddenly, a new sound cut through the chaos, the thundering of many horses approaching at speed. What the hell? Caleb muttered, peering cautiously through a broken window, his face transformed with surprise. Riley, it's the marshal, and he's brought company. Sure enough, the gunfire from Holloway's men abruptly ceased, replaced by shouts of alarm and the sounds of retreat. Through the shattered window, Penelope caught glimpses of uniformed men surrounding the cabin, their rifles trained on Holloway's retreating forces. "Federal marshals," a commanding voice bellowed. "Drop your weapons and surrender." What followed was a blur of activity. Some of Holloway's men attempted to flee, only to be quickly captured by the marshals' superior numbers. Others, seeing the futility of resistance, surrendered on the spot. And in the midst of it all stood Victor Holloway, his face contorted with rage as he was disarmed and restrained. When Marshal Davis entered the cabin, Penelope's first impression was of a man carved from granite tall, imposing, with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. Those eyes softened slightly as they fell on Riley, who had slumped into a chair, the strain of the battle having taken its toll. "You always did know how to throw a welcome party, Garrett," the marshal said dryly, but there was concern beneath the humor. "Took you long enough, Davis," Riley replied with a weak smile. The marshal's attention turned to Penelope. "You must be Miss Norwood," he said. "You've caused quite a stir." "Not by choice, sir," Penelope replied, lifting her chin slightly. Davis nodded, his expression thoughtful. "So I understand. Riley's telegram was most illuminating, particularly the parts about forced marriage and threats against your life." "They're true," Penelope said simply. "I believe you," Davis assured her. "And not just because Riley vouches for you. We've had our eye on Holloway for some time, suspicions of cattle rustling, extortion, even murder. But he's been careful, covering his tracks. Your testimony could be the key to finally bringing him to justice." Hope, so long suppressed, flared in Penelope's chest. "You mean I could be free of him?" "Truly free, that's the plan," Davis confirmed. "Though I won't pretend it will be easy. Holloway still has friends in high places. But with what we have now and your testimony," he shrugged, "let's just say I like our chances." As the marshal turned away to give orders to his men, Penelope moved to Riley's side, taking his hand in hers. "You did this," she said softly. "You've given me my freedom." Riley's fingers tightened around hers. "You were never meant to be caged, Penelope. Not by Holloway, not by anyone." She studied his face, pale from blood loss but still handsome, still dear to her in a way she was only beginning to understand. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Riley said, a tired smile touching his lips, "we rest, we heal, and then we figure out what comes next, together if that's what you want." "Together," Penelope repeated, the word like a promise on her lips. "Yes, I think I'd like that very much." The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity and change. Victor Holloway, along with several of his men, was transported to Boise to stand trial for his crimes. Penelope, as the key witness, was required to travel there as well to give her testimony. Riley, still recovering from his wound but refusing to let her go alone, accompanied her, as did Marshal Davis, who personally guaranteed her safety. The trial was grueling. Holloway's attorneys attempted to paint Penelope as unstable, ungrateful, even delusional. But she stood firm, recounting the years of psychological abuse, the threats, the attempted forced marriage with a clarity and dignity that impressed even the most skeptical observers. When Riley took the stand and described finding her half frozen in the snow, fleeing for her life, his quiet conviction swayed many who might otherwise have dismissed her claims. And when Marshal Davis presented evidence of Holloway's other crimes, evidence gathered over years of patient investigation, the case against him became overwhelming. In the end, justice prevailed. Victor Holloway was sentenced to 15 years in the territorial prison for his crimes. His empire of fear and corruption dismantled piece by piece. On the day the verdict was announced, Penelope stood outside the courthouse in Boise, breathing deeply of the spring air, feeling truly free for the first time in years. "How does it feel?" Riley asked, coming to stand beside her. His wound had healed well, though he still moved with a slight stiffness that might never entirely fade, a permanent reminder of what he had risked for her. "I'm not sure I have words for it," Penelope admitted. "Relief, certainly. Joy, but also uncertainty. My life has been defined by surviving him for so long. Now I need to figure out who I am without that shadow." Riley nodded, understanding in his eyes. "You have time now, all the time in the world." Penelope turned to face him fully. "What about you, Riley? What do you want now that this is over?" He considered the question, his blue eyes thoughtful. "I want to go home," he said simply. "Back to my ranch. Back to the life I was building." He paused, then added more softly, "But I find I don't want to go back to the solitude I once embraced. I've grown." "Accustomed to your company, Penelope Norwood." Her heart quickened at his words, at the warmth in his eyes as they looked at her. "Is that your way of asking me to return to Snake River with you?" "It's my way of asking for a chance," Riley said, taking her hand in his. "A chance to see what might grow between us, without danger and fear hanging over our heads." Penelope thought of the small ranch nestled in its valley, of the cabin that had offered her sanctuary when she needed it most. She thought of quiet evenings by the fire, of Caleb's gruff kindness, of Riley's steadfast presence that had become so essential to her. "Yes," she said, squeezing his hand. "I would like that chance very much." The journey back to Snake River was like traveling to a different world than the one they had left. Spring had fully arrived in their absence, transforming the landscape. Where there had been snow now lay carpets of wildflowers, the creek running full and swift with snowmelt from the mountains. The ranch, too, had changed, or perhaps it was Penelope's perception of it that had changed. What had once been a refuge now felt like a beginning, a place of possibility rather than merely safety. Caleb welcomed them back with a feast that belied his usual plain cooking, and news that the cattle had weathered the remainder of winter well, with a healthy crop of spring, calves already dotting the pastures. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of gold and pink, Riley turned to Penelope with an expression she had come to know well, a look that said he had something important to say, but was searching for the right words. "I've been thinking," he began, "about what happens next." Penelope smiled encouragingly. "And what have you concluded?" "That I'd like to court you properly," Riley said, a hint of color touching his cheeks. "If you're amenable, no more pretending you're my cousin or my ranch hand. No more hiding. Just a man and a woman, seeing if what began in extraordinary circumstances can flourish in ordinary ones." Warmth spread through Penelope's chest at his words, so earnest and so very Riley in their straightforward honesty. "I'd like that," she said softly. "It won't always be easy," he warned. "Ranch life is hard and He hesitated. "I'm not always good with words, not like those fancy Eastern men you might have known." Penelope reached out, placing her hand over his where it rested on the arm of his chair. "I've had enough of fancy words that mean nothing," she said. "I prefer honest actions, like a man who would wrap a freezing stranger in his coat and promise her safety. Like a man who would risk everything to keep that promise." Riley turned his hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. "Then I'll court you with honest actions, Penelope Norwood, and we'll see where they lead us." The courtship that followed was, as Riley had predicted, not always easy. They were two strong-willed individuals, each shaped by loss and hardship in different ways. There were disagreements, misunderstandings, moments when their different backgrounds and experiences created gulfs that seemed impossible to bridge. But there was also joy, simple, profound joy in discovering each other day by day. Penelope found in Riley a depth of character that continually surprised and moved her. His quiet strength, his unwavering integrity, his unexpected tenderness all revealed themselves gradually, like treasures being carefully unwrapped. Riley, in turn, was captivated by Penelope's resilience, her quick mind, and the gentle heart that had somehow survived years of cruelty without becoming hardened. He admired her determination to build a new life, to learn the skills needed for ranch living, riding, gardening, even helping with cattle drives when extra hands were needed. Through spring and into summer they grew together, their lives intertwining naturally, inevitably. Penelope moved from the small bedroom to a larger one that had once been Riley's mother's, though they maintained separate quarters, respecting the proprieties despite the remote location of the ranch. Word of their courtship spread through the scattered community around Snake River, bringing curious visitors who were often surprised to find the reclusive Riley Garrett so transformed by the presence of the Eastern woman who had chosen to make her home with him. Widow Jenkins became a frequent visitor and a staunch ally, bringing with her gifts of preserves and practical advice for Penelope as she adjusted to frontier life. In the older woman's company, Penelope found something she had lost with her mother's death: female friendship and guidance, freely offered without expectation or judgment. It was Martha Jenkins who first spoke aloud what others had only hinted at. "When's the wedding to be?" she asked bluntly one afternoon as she and Penelope picked berries in the sun-warmed patch behind the cabin. "That man of yours has been mooning over you for months now. Time to make an honest woman of you, I say." Penelope's cheeks flushed with heat that had nothing to do with the summer sun. "He hasn't asked," she admitted, "and I'm not sure he will." Martha snorted disbelievingly. "Of course he will. He's just building up the courage. Men are strange creatures when it comes to matters of the heart, especially men like Riley who have been on their own too long." That evening, as if Martha's words had conjured it, Riley asked Penelope to walk with him after supper. They followed the creek that ran through the property, its waters now gentled from the spring rush, murmuring peacefully as they flowed over smooth stones. When they reached a particular bend where the creek widened into a natural pool, surrounded by willows whose branches trailed in the water, Riley stopped. This had become a favorite spot of Penelope's, a place where she often came to read or simply to think. "I have something for you," Riley said, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a small object, holding it carefully in his palm. "It was my mother's." Penelope looked down at a ring, a simple gold band with a small diamond that caught the last rays of sunlight, sending prisms of color dancing across Riley's weather-bronzed skin. "Riley," she breathed, her heart suddenly racing. "I'm not a man of grand gestures or flowery speeches," he said, his voice steady despite the nerves evident in his eyes. "But I know what I want, Penelope. I want to build a life with you, not just for now, but for always." He took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "These past months, they've been the happiest of my life. You've brought light and laughter into a place that had too little of both. You've shown me that solitude isn't the only way to find peace." Penelope's eyes filled with tears as Riley continued, his words simple but profound in their sincerity. "I love you, Penelope Norwood. I think I started loving you that night in the snow, though I didn't know it then. And if you'll have me, I'd consider it the greatest honor of my life to be your husband." "Yes," Penelope whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Riley, I will." His smile as he slipped the ring onto her finger was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, radiant with joy and promise. When he kissed her, it felt like coming home after a long journey, like finding a place in the world that was perfectly, uniquely hers. They were married on a golden September day, with the aspen trees just beginning to turn to flame around the valley. The ceremony was small but joyful, held in the meadow beside the ranch house. Marshall Davis journeyed from Boise to stand as Riley's best man, while Martha Jenkins, resplendent in her Sunday best, proudly served as Penelope's matron of honor. Caleb, scrubbed clean and uncomfortable in a borrowed suit, beamed with undisguised happiness for the couple he had come to regard as family. As Penelope spoke her vows, wearing a simple white dress that Martha had helped her sew, she marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment. From terror and desperation in a snowstorm to this day of joy and promise, it seemed almost too much to believe. Yet as she looked into Riley's eyes, saw the love and devotion shining there, she knew that this was real. This man, this place, this life they were building together, all of it was real, and it was hers. The celebration that followed was lively despite the small number of guests, with food and drink flowing freely, music provided by a fiddler from town, and dancing that continued well into the evening. As twilight deepened into night, Riley took Penelope's hand and led her away from the festivities, toward the cabin that was now truly their home. "Happy?" he asked as they paused on the porch, the sounds of merriment fading behind them. Penelope looked up at him, at this man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved, and felt her heart swell with a joy so profound, it was almost painful. "More than I ever thought possible," she said honestly. As they crossed the threshold together, Riley gathering her into his arms to carry her over in accordance with tradition, Penelope had a sudden, vivid memory of that night in the snow, of strong arms lifting her, of a coat wrapped around her trembling body, of a voice promising safety. Riley had kept that promise and so many more since then. And now they stood at the beginning of a new journey together, one that would have its own challenges and triumphs, joys and sorrows. But they would face them side by side, two people who had found in each other not just love, but home. The years that followed proved that their love was no fleeting thing born of extraordinary circumstances, but a deep and enduring bond that only strengthened with time. The ranch prospered under their joint care, expanding gradually as Riley's careful management and Penelope's shrewd business sense, inherited from her professor father, combined to create a modest but sustainable operation. 2 years after their wedding, their family grew with the birth of a son, whom they named James after Riley's father. The boy had his father's blue eyes and his mother's auburn hair, and from an early age showed a spirit of independence and curiosity that both delighted and occasionally exasperated his parents. When James was 3, he was joined by a sister, Margaret, named for Penelope's mother. Where James was bold and adventurous, Margaret was thoughtful and observant, with a quiet strength that reminded Riley uncannily of his wife. Caleb, who had initially threatened to leave once all this domesticity invaded the ranch, instead found himself promoted to honorary uncle, a role he embraced with surprising enthusiasm. His gruff exterior melted entirely in the presence of the children, who adored his stories and the small wooden toys he carved for them during the long winter evenings. Penelope, who had once feared she would never escape the shadow of her stepfather's cruelty, found in motherhood a healing she hadn't known she needed. The unconditional love she gave her children and received in return helped to mend the last fractured pieces of her heart. Victor Holloway remained in prison, his appeals denied one by one as the years passed. When word came that he had died there, 5 years into his sentence, Penelope felt not triumph or even relief, but a complex sadness, not for the man himself, but for all that had been lost because of his actions. Riley held her that night as she cried tears she hadn't expected to shed, understanding without words that closure sometimes came in unexpected forms. Life on the frontier was never easy. There were harsh winters when the cattle suffered despite their best efforts, dry summers when the creek ran low and crops struggled, threats from rustlers, and the occasional unscrupulous land speculator. But there were also moments of transcendent beauty and joy: sunrise over the mountains, wildflowers carpeting the meadows in spring, their children's laughter echoing across the valley. Through it all, Riley and Penelope faced each challenge together, their partnership a source of strength that neither would have found alone. They built not just a ranch but a true home, a place where love and respect were the foundation of everything they did. On the 10th anniversary of the night Riley had found Penelope in the snow, they stood together on the porch of their cabin, now expanded into a proper house, with rooms for their growing family, watching as the first flakes of winter began to fall. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't found me that night?" Penelope asked, leaning against Riley's solid warmth. "No," he said simply, his arm tightening around her waist. "Because I was always going to find you, even if I didn't know I was looking." Penelope smiled, turning her face up to his. At 30, she was more beautiful to Riley than she had been at 20, her beauty now enriched by experience, by joy and sorrow weathered together, by the depth of understanding that had grown between them over the years. "I love you, Riley Garrett," she said softly, the words familiar yet never routine, never taken for granted. "And I love you, Penelope Garrett," he replied, bending to kiss her as the snow fell gently around them, transforming the world once more into the white landscape where their story had begun. Inside the house, their children slept peacefully. Caleb snored contentedly in his room off the kitchen, and the fire burned warm and bright against the gathering cold. All was as it should be, not perfect, perhaps, but real and true, and earned through courage and perseverance. From desperate flight through a snowstorm to this moment of quiet contentment, it was a journey neither of them could have imagined on that fateful night. But as they stood together watching the snow, they knew it was exactly where they were meant to be.